Okay, it's 9 o'clock. I think we need to get started. A couple of matters. First, I want to remind everyone to please turn off your cell phone. That would be of help. Secondly, we have a number of guests today. There's a special weekend, as many of you know, here in Hanover. Dartmouth plays Harvard. And because of that and some other meetings and so forth, we have a number of guests here who have not been here before. Some of you may have never been to Hanover before. But welcome to the class. And let me suggest to you and to everyone else that my goal in doing these 5 lectures is to not solve the problem in the Middle East, but to try to be successful in informing all of us why there's a problem, why these people can't just get along anyway. And if I have succeeded in opening that window up so that you can now understand why there is this terrible problem about which the front pages of the newspapers all over the world are writing every day what's going on, then we will have achieved that goal of mine. Now, this is an unusual weekend. This is Dartmouth football homecoming. Alumni across the country are asking the 2024 Ivy League football championship, whose title will it be anyway? We here in the room are asking, whose land is it anyway? The admired and beloved Dartmouth coach, Buddy Tevens, is honored by renaming Dartmouth's football stadium. The new and exciting Sammy Corkle has an opportunity to make history, to win the title or set the situation in motion this afternoon for Dartmouth, possibly to win the Ivy League title. It is now his team, our team, the Big Green, that has an unbroken win record so far this year. This afternoon, they will face Harvard, who has had 1 Ivy League loss. Alumni here in Hanover and across the country are watching. But there are 2 sets of alumni. There are those of us who have earned degrees from both schools, have divided loyalties, and a number of them are here with us this morning. We welcome you. Some of my former classmates from Harvard have driven a long distance this morning to get here. Others from Boston, from Brandeis University, from Cambridge. They come from all over to be here, and I appreciate your joining us this morning. The question of whose title rather than whose land goes back, way back, further than the 1948 Israeli-Palestinian War. In fact, back to 1884, when Dartmouth and Harvard first faced each other. I found this program from 1958. How's that, Sven? The competition is keen. 10,000 men of Harvard want victory today. The song and the Radcliffe Choral Society, of which Tom is a member. Maybe you're in this, Tom. auspicious, the opportunity this morning to appreciate and understand both competitions. One, a game. They play by rules, shake hands, appreciate good sportsmanship. The other, a matter of survival, life and death. Reviewing where we are, week 1, 2 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago now, the first class, we talked about the history of the land of Canaan, the Holy Land, and those that were promised to Abraham by God, presumably, and we reviewed those many, many peoples who lived on that land. 2 weeks ago, we discussed why Jews were hated and their need to run, to flee. Now, I showed you this carving the very first week, and I wondered to myself after showing it to you, where is this carving? We all know this. This is the Jews leaving in 73 AD as the Romans came in and took over their land, and they fled all over the world, called the diaspora. And this is an engraving from that time. And I was wondering, well, where in fact is this actual piece? So I did a little investigation and learned that it sits in Rome, of course, celebrating their overcoming the Canaanites, the Israelis, in the land of Canaan, the war of which ended in 73 AD. It turns out that Faye and I were in Rome last November. We walked through this area where the Colosseum, etc., the Arch of Titus, as you can see with my red arrow, and it really didn't dawn on me to look carefully. But if you're in Rome and you look through this arch where my arrow shows, you will see on the wall, there it is, the depiction in Rome of how they overcame the folks in Palestine, in the Holy Land, ending in 73 AD, and they carried this back with them to Rome. Okay, now what are we going to do today? Today are two stories, literally the ecstasy and the agony. Part 1 we'll do before refreshments is the Israeli story. Part 2, the Palestinian story. The two stories are of the same land, the same time, but looked at totally differently. And understanding those two stories will help us understand the dilemma today. First, the Israeli story. And I want to share with you just a few snippets of each of the national anthems. First, the Israeli anthem. And then maybe some of you remember the movie Exodus from 1960. How many of you have seen Exodus? It turns out that all of us, many of us, thought that this was the story. This movie really told the story. Now, with a retrospective look, with reevaluating, it's not quite the same. But let me play for you what we all watched and listened to back in 1960.
God gave this all to me. This brave dimension lied to me. And when the morning sun reveals her with the love of God, I'm gonna transform.
That came out in 1960. I was in college in Cambridge, and I thought over and over, oh, if only I could have been Ari Ben Canaan and been there with Eva Marie Saint. I must have watched that movie a dozen different times over the years, thinking, that's the story. How wonderful to have been Ari Ben Canaan. Now I look at it a little bit differently. Now there's a good deal of revisionist history. That movie is now looked upon as really, really old school. So to explain this, in brief, what are we going to do today? What we're going to do is the following. The Jews move into the Promised Land. They're escaping from persecution around the world. The Arabs and the British resist. The Arabs are displaced. British duplicity. The Jews fight the British. The Arabs fight the Jews. The path to a state and al-Nakba, the Arabic-Palestinian catastrophe. 51 years. Let me suggest right at the beginning that in your booklet that I gave you, that each of you have, in the back, there's a list of suggested books and movies. If you only watch one movie, go on YouTube with your computer and you'll see how the British started the Arab-Israeli conflict. I can only touch on this. You'll get a bit of it. But that movie does it beautifully. So please, at home, if you have interest in this, it's in the back of your book, listed how the British started the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's easy. Just go to YouTube and type in that title and watch the movie. So whose land is it, anyway? How did the state of Israel come about? In a land controlled by the Ottomans for 400 years, those living there, the Arabic Palestinians, never created a state. A series of decisions, duplicity, dishonesty, and disdain for an indigenous population planted the seeds of continuing conflict. Palestinians were pursuing their lives as usual, engaging in Middle Eastern commerce, as Jews began to think, plan, and move at the beginning of the 20th century. I remember actually classmates of ours, classmates of ours left Harvard and went to work in Israel during the 60s. A group of young socialist revolutionaries, which would include a founder of the future state of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, immigrated to Palestine in waves from Russia and Eastern Europe, and some of us from Harvard. Fleeing ghettos, impoverishment, and the violence of pogroms, they believed that the only real and safe answer to the global affliction of the hatred of Jews was Zionism, the vision of some place on earth that would be safe. Argentina and Uganda were considered. But in the end, a Jewish home in the land of the Hebrew Bible, from which they had been driven by the Romans 2,000 years before, was decided upon. The Arab population wanted what every majority native people want: self-determination. Jews who immigrated in growing numbers wanted what all persecuted minorities almost never attain: a haven in their ancient homeland, safely away from the hatred and danger they faced around the world. The story up to 1895, which we'll do today, was quickly Masada and the diaspora, the expulsion from Europe of the Jews, the Russian pogroms, the 1895 Dreyfus trial in Paris, which Theodor Herzl attended, the journalist from Vienna, and then decided, as I explained to you, what he concluded, that if Jews cannot be safe in France, the home of the revolution, then they must form their own state. And it was he who wrote the book Der Judenstaat, in an attempt to convince people that there must be a Jewish state to which Jews can safely live. And it was he who formed and pulled together people for the first Zionist Congress, which was in 1897. Again, here's the book, Der Judenstaat, and it's a tale, I like to think, of two cities, appreciating the anti-Semitism and the difficulties that arose for the Jews in Vienna, and the Viennese journalist Herzl leaving Vienna, going to Paris, attending the trial, and then writing this book, which essentially set everything in motion about which we read today. And here's a photo of the first Zionist Congress in Basel, which Theodor Herzl pulled together. As a result, the Palestinian land that had been envisioned in Switzerland, here's a map that's in Herzl's book. And that map, which you see here, which was in the original Judenstaat book, would lead to trouble, now 75 years of trouble. Whose land was it, anyway? As a result of Jews fleeing Russian pogroms 1880 to 1915, the largest percent of whom came to the United States, approximately 40,000 Jews moved from Europe to Palestine between those years 1880 and 1915. World War I ends. What remained of the Ottoman Empire, having collaborated with Germany, is finished. Turkey and its control of the Middle East is finished. To the victor goes the spoils. How shall the land be divided? England and France would decide. Might would make right. The importance of the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf oil to the British. Here's a cartoon carving up the Middle East. Again, might makes right. Self-serving interests are, of course, what every country pursues. As World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, England found itself in a particularly advantageous, yet at the same time previously responsible situation. The English decisions would take the form of three documents: the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the McMahon Correspondence, and the Balfour Declaration. Together they would set the scene for never-ending misunderstandings, feelings of betrayal, strife, conflict, and thousands of deaths up to the present day. Those three documents, all British, would be followed by British conferences, commissions, reports, white papers of policy, all of which served to further aggravate matters in the Middle East. Please do watch the movie that I suggested. Taken together, they were to many disheartening, double-dealing, duplicitous, disingenuous, deceiving, devilishly demonic, and in the end, disastrous. Sykes and Picot, 1916, with the Middle East portion of the Ottoman Empire expected to become a relic of the past at the end of World War I, and with no concern for the indigenous people, a British and French diplomat, Mark Sykes and Francois Georges Picot, negotiated a deal between them to draw lines and split up the Middle East into zones of influence, British and French, if you will, never consulting with the local Arabs and keeping their decision completely secret from any Arab leader and the general Arab population. In doing so, Great Britain started a pattern of breaking promises made to Arabs. The arbitrary lines in the sand that Sykes and Picot drew would influence the course of history and ultimately contribute to wars, internal conflict, the use of terrorism, and hundreds of thousands of deaths. As the years progressed, Great Britain became a nation never to be trusted in the Middle East. Not surprisingly, oil interests in the canal played major roles. As if the British-French Sykes-Picot Treaty didn't muddy the waters enough for a future peaceful Palestine, the Brits added to their betrayal of the Arabs by being part of what might be called a sleazy deal. The British were at it again with what is known as the McMahon Correspondence, a series of 10 letters over the course of a year, 1915-1916. England's Sir Henry McMahon, a British High Commissioner in Egypt during World War I, reached out to an Arab leader with a duplicitous deal. McMahon wrote 10 letters to the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, offering him a swap. England would recognize an independent Arab state somewhere with ill-defined boundaries if the Arabs helped England by revolting against the Ottoman Turks, which were allied to Germany. The Turks believing in jihad, a holy war against the Brits. If the Arabs would learn to feel betrayed by McMahon's promise of an independent state with non-defined borders, somewhere, someplace, sometime, that would be nothing to what followed. Lord Arthur Balfour, British Foreign Secretary in 1916, aristocratic and British to the core, intellectual, wealthy, a product of Eton, Trinity, Cambridge, and a former Conservative Member of Parliament, was a close friend of Englishman Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann, a PhD chemist, as well as an ardent Zionist, had close connections to the chemical world of acetone, vitally important to the British. From acetone could be made cordite, a necessary step to producing gunpowder. The Brits valued and needed gunpowder. Weizmann, appreciating an opening, a golden opportunity, and the aphorism is who you know and your access to acetone, easily convinced Lord Balfour to write a letter to Weizmann's Jewish friend Baron Edmund de Rothschild, also an ardent supporter of Zionism, a super wealthy ardent Zionist. The 67-word statement by the British Foreign Secretary promised his country's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. At the time the document was written, the Jews made up 8% of that population, and a safeguarding of the civil and religious rights of the Palestinians, whatever that meant. The Arab population in Palestine, at the time the declaration was written, made up 92% of the population in the Holy Land. That 67-word letter to a private citizen, albeit a very wealthy private citizen, would change world history and help protect British interests in the Egyptian Suez Canal. Now there was a bit of Israeli-Palestinian sleight of hand. Needing the U.S. support for such a homeland, the idea was to come to the United States and gain acceptance from our country for a land for the Jews. What happened was that it was decided by Lord Balfour that he wanted to meet neither Secretary of State Robert Lansing nor President Wilson, both of whom didn't look with favor on Jews any more than they looked upon with favor African Americans. And so Lord Balfour, being astute and knowing how to play the sleight of hand game in the United States in Washington, chose, instead of meeting with the President or the Secretary of State, met with Justice Louis Brandeis. Brandeis, from Louisville, Kentucky, was an ardent Zionist, a Jew to the core. Lord Balfour met with Brandeis, and in a letter from Brandeis, with no other approval by our government, wrote a letter giving United States approval for the Balfour Declaration and that the Jews should have a home in the Holy Land. After the conclusion of World War I, 1920, France, Italy, Britain, and Japan met in San Remo on the coast of Italy, just to the east of Monaco, to decide the fate of territories that were previously under the control of the Ottoman Empire. The conference gave international legal legitimacy to the Balfour Declaration, a home for the Jewish people, and essentially ignored the Sykes-Picot Treaty and the McMahon Correspondence. And then in 1921, Winston Churchill, at that time the colonial secretary, reaffirmed British commitment to Zionism. But how are the British to administer the land of Palestine with its indigenous Arab population and continually arriving Jews? Britain needed help to do this and international authorization to rule over the Holy Land. For this, they turned to the League of Nations. In 1922, July 24th, the League of Nations appointed England to administer the people and the land of Palestine. The mandate for the British was a sacred opportunity and obligation to the people living in Palestine after the stagnation of 400 years of Turkish rule. The document was an attempt to redress an imbalance, tilted by a long historic neglect by the Ottomans, by a deliberate political act, and the establishment of a government administration. It was a novel historic experiment, which the British were only too happy to try, giving their self-interest in that part of the world. In retrospect, it was a grievous error of judgment that no positive statement was made recognizing the rights of the indigenous Arab population, a statement which might have formed the basis of cooperation for all the years to come. What did the mandate say, given by the League of Nations to the British? Number one, Britain was to be responsible for political action and the economic conditions which will secure the establishment of a Jewish national home and the development of a self-governing institutions, establishment of a Jewish agency, which will cooperate with Palestinian administrations, in a Palestinian administration in all matters, and, quote, ensure the rights and privileges of other sections of the population are not prejudiced while facilitating Jewish immigration. The Jews enjoyed critical connections along the Thames with the great and the good. The Arabs had none of these connections in London. While on the ground in Palestine, hundreds of miles from London, the British colonial military officials in Jerusalem and throughout the land of Canaan made no secret of their disfavor of the Balfour Declaration, siding rather with the Arab population, with whom they had relations for years, and whom they knew how to control. In Palestine, after all, dealing with the Jews on the ground was another matter, always a challenge for the British. Composing only 8% of the population, by the time the Brits arrived in 1923, the Jews had developed their own educational systems, courts of justice, health facilities, and the fight against malaria. The Jews looked to their well-established Jewish agency with ties, advice, and funding from Europe and America. The Arabs looked only to their fundamentalist Islamic religious leaders. Both groups imagined the British being in command only temporarily. It took little time for violence to break out. The Arabs resented the Jews who wanted and were taking their land, and the Jews resented the British who were trying to keep additional Jews from arriving. And this is some shots of the violence that erupted during these years. By the mid-20s, the Jews present found intolerable the attitude of non-acceptance, if not downright hostility by the British, and the Palestinians toward continuing Jewish immigration. The British officers in Palestine had become accustomed to dealing with the Arab Bedouin shepherds. They were not used to the European Jews, who were often as well educated or more so than themselves. The Brits found the sullen resentment of one group, the Arabs, no easier to deal with than the utopian enthusiasm of the other, the Jews. Changes in British attitude had to take place, as seen from the Jewish point of view, but 2 points of view as to how to bring this about. On the one hand, Weizmann, the erudite chemist in London, thought by slow, peaceful negotiating means. Ben-Gurion, on the ground in Palestine, with Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin in Israel, thought that change would only come about by force. Killing continued between the Arabs and the Jews, the worst of which was in 1929, Arabs massacred 66 ultra-Orthodox Jews while they were praying in Hebron and Safad. How should the British deal with the problem? 1929, a royal commission, always another commission, and a Simpson report. A recognition in London that the Arab Palestinians have come to see in Jewish immigration a menace to their livelihood and their way of life. The report by Sir John Simpson, which was a flip-flop from the Balfour Declaration. No land should be made available by the British for further settlement by new Jewish immigrants. 1930, the Passfield White Paper. Now the affirmation of that flip-flop. Priority should be given to Britain's obligation to Arabs and a halt to Jewish immigration. Protests by Palestinian Jews and London Zionists. 1931, the next year, another British flip-flop. Ramsay MacDonald, in a letter to Weitzman, nullified the Passfield White Paper, reaffirming the 1917 Balfour Declaration. It was back and forth in London, frustrating everyone in Palestine. The Arabs become convinced that due to their lack of connections in the British capital, changes in their favor made by the British in Palestine can be easily nullified by influential Zionists in London. December 1931, a Muslim conference is held in Jerusalem with 22 Arab countries attending, discussing the dangers of Zionism. Lines were drawn, plans for fighting. In reaction to this, in Palestine, developed autonomous underground Jewish military organizations for defense against the Arab world and against the Brits, should the UK try to limit immigration. And here you see the names of the four well-known underground Jewish groups: the Palmach, the Irgun, the Stern Gang, and the Haganah. None of them official, none of them government, all rising up by themselves and forming these groups, both to fight the Arabs, but mostly to fight the British in order to keep the ports of Haifa open so further Jews could come in to Palestine. What was to become the Israeli Defense Force were groups of citizens fighting both the indigenous Palestinians and the British, who wanted to limit Jewish immigration. And here you see a photo of young Menachem Begin, who was the director of the Irgun. Menachem Begin then became the most wanted man by the British. Posters went up all over the country, and I have a circle on the upper left. You see young Menachem Begin, and a large amount of money was offered for his capture, and he has the distinguished position of having been declared a terrorist with a bounty over his head, and the only person we know of who from that position became the prime minister of the country for whom he was then fighting. With the Nazis in Europe coming to power, Jewish immigration to Palestine mushroomed, and you see the statistics as the percent of the population in Palestine. 1936 to 1939, constant Arab revolt. In 1937, back to London, the Peel Commission, accepting the irreconcilable differences between the Arabs and Jews, Westminster recommended that Palestine be partitioned, one area to become a Jewish state on 17% of the land, and the remaining 83% of Palestine for indigenous Arabs. Pragmatic Zionists accepted the proposal, although not happy with the small size the British gave them. In contrast, the Palestinians rejected outright partition as a theft of Palestinian land and demanded that Palestine as a whole become an Arab state and all Jews be required to leave. This was an opportunity, and they took this opportunity to pass that opportunity. So then another British white paper, which repudiated the Balfour Declaration. This white paper set a limit of 10,000 Jews would be allowed into Palestine each year for 5 years, with a limit of 75,000 by the end of 1944. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain wanted to appease the Arabs, as he had done with Hitler. Ben-Gurion found British intransigence unacceptable. Their limiting future immigration of Jews to 10,000 per year for 5 years was impossible and not negotiable. The 1939 White Paper, like the McMahon Correspondence of 1915-16, promised Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, and Lebanon their independence. The British, while early on finding the Arabs eager to manage the Jews, they had no real love for the Muslims. The Arabs under Turkish rule had identified with the Axis Nazis. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, had traveled to Berlin to meet with Adolf Hitler in November 1941. They both were opponents of the British Empire, and both wanted to totally eliminate a Jewish presence in the Middle East and Europe. Hitler had seen an opportunity to gain an ally in the Arab world and further his anti-Semitic agenda. The Palestinian Jews had formed their own World War II Jewish brigade to join the American and British allies, fearful to their bones of what would happen to them if the Nazis were successful in traveling across North Africa and entered Palestine. David Ben-Gurion, while detesting the 1939 White Paper from London, famously said, "We shall fight in the war against Hitler as if there were no White Paper, but we shall fight the White Paper as if there were no war." The Israelis, training by the Americans and the British forces, would be useful to them once the Nazis were defeated for a coming war against the Arabs. The irony and shame is that after the war, the same two countries, the United States and the United Kingdom, bolted their doors to immigrant Jews while having gratefully accepted help from the Palestinian Jewish Brigade in the war effort. In 1940, British denied landing rights to a number of ships carrying refugees from war-torn Europe, forcing immigrants to return to Nazi Europe. Death camps were discovered. Millions needed someplace to go. U.S. and England refused. Both Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill locked the doors to Jews coming in to the United Kingdom and our country. In reaction to this, the Irgun with Begin, developed guerrilla warfare against the British. Either allow unlimited immigration or relinquish the mandate and the Brits must leave the country. More than one half of 142 ships arriving in Haifa were stopped by the British patrol boats and turned away. 50,000 refugees were sent to internment camps in Cyprus and Mauritius, or concentration camps in Palestine set up by the British. 1,600 drowned by jumping off ships which were turned away. And should you be of interest, there are 5 stories about which I don't have time to go into, but there are 5 notable ships that were turned away with disastrous results, and all of these can be looked up on Wikipedia. The Struma, the St. Louis, the Patria, the Altalena, and the Exodus. All of these ships were turned away by the British, and those trying to escape Europe were turned away. In 1942, the Biltmore Program. Zionists from around the world decided to meet in the one city in the world with the largest Jewish population. That would be New York. What they decided upon is full Jewish statehood, nothing less. Meanwhile, the frantic efforts are made by Jews in Europe to flee and go somewhere, as the Jews already in Palestine were fighting both the indigenous Arab Palestinians, either buying up their property or forcing them to leave their homes, and fighting the British, who were controlling entry to further Jews. The Brits trying their best to maintain parity between the Jews and the Arabs. In 1945, in utter frustration, back in London, Ernest Bevin Foreign Secretary tells Parliament no further Jewish immigration. Chaim Weizmann in London, with all his connections, learns that the British are considering ending their responsibilities in Palestine. The British had had enough. The Palestinian Arabs have no such connection in London. Weizmann immediately notified David Ben-Gurion on the ground in Israel. He notifies him that all the underground military groups, the Haganah, the Irgun, the Palmach, and the Stern Gang, they must all go into action. The British looked the other way as the Jews arranged for streaming into Palestine arms, tanks, planes, and ammunitions. With the discovery of the Holocaust and millions of refugees in need of a home, this is what the statistics look like at the time in Palestine. Now there are 650,000 Jews in Palestine, representing 35% of the population. It's a dire situation, and so Begin, with the Irgun, decided to take the matter in his own hands in an attempt to drive the British out and open up the doors wide for the Jews to come in. When Ben-Gurion learns from the British they will soon want to give up their mandate and responsibilities. The British resolved to remain in the Middle East. They wanted the canal but couldn't square the responsibility under the mandate with the reality on the ground. World War II had left Britain victorious but exhausted, and their work in the Middle East was frustrating them beyond end. So Begin decided to go after the British officers that were all housed in the West Wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And here is what happened. Begin blew up with his Irgun underground Jewish forces the West Wing and killing all of the Jewish officers in their offices in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. After the war, I'm sorry? What did I say? Sorry. Thank you. After the war, the Brits lacked the funds and political will to maintain control of colonial possessions, all of which were agitating with increasing violence for independence. The Palestinian Jews predictably predict that the Arabs will attack them as soon as the British leave. Procurement of arms by the Jews becomes a necessity, slipping their imports past the British a challenge. From France, they obtained cannons. From Czechoslovakia, Messerschmitt planes, cannons, tanks, machine guns. And from the United States, surreptitiously through Mexico, flying Fortress heavy bombers. This was the map as it appeared with Palestinians controlling the greatest amount of the land. And this was as the land was divided between 1917 and 1947, controlled by the British. The British officers are now living behind barbed wire to protect themselves from those whom they were supposed to be governing. The Israelis, the Jewish Palestinians were doing their best to drive the British out. The gates of the world were still shut. More than 2 years after the end of the war, the survivors of Hitler's final solution were international outcasts, camped in the country of their martyrdom under the looming presence and collective memory of Masada. February 1947, Prime Minister Clement Attlee had had enough. He wanted out. The Palestine question was to be turned over to the United Nations. And it was these same years that the British had had enough in India. And they withdrew from both India, and at that time they had 80,000 troops in Palestine that they wanted to bring home. The United Nations, 1947. The matter was turned over to the United Nations by the British, who had been functioning under the British mandate. And at the United Nations, this division was decided upon. The United Nations would partition the Holy Land, giving significant land to both the Israelis, the Jews, and the Palestinians. At that time, There were 678,000 Jews and 150,000 Arabs living on 78% of the land, 1,269,000 Arabs living on 22% of the land. On May 14th, in reaction to United Nations dividing the land of partition, Truman had a decision to make as to whether the United States should recognize the state of Israel. He wasn't sure what he should do. But back in Missouri, just outside of Kansas City, he had been in business with a Jewish haberdasher selling men's clothes. This guy's name was Eddie Jacobson. Harry Truman called Eddie, his friend back in Independence, Missouri, and asked Eddie, what do you think I should do? And Eddie in Kansas City, near Kansas City, said, Harry, sign the paper and recognize the state of Israel. So here he is. Harry Truman, taking Eddie Jacobson's suggestion, with David Ben-Gurion at the White House, signs the paper which brings into force the state of Israel with Abba Eban looking over their shoulders. The state of Israel, with Harry Truman's signature, urged on by Eddie Jacobson near Independence, Missouri, was notified that the world now had a new state. The state of Israel was born. David Ben-Gurion was prime minister, and Chaim Weizmann was president. What would their immediate program be? Immigration open to all Jews from anywhere in the world. If you were Jewish, you could come to Israel. Unified public education system, which would be the only public education system in the Middle East. Irrigation of desert lands as far as one could see to grow crops. And a firm defense policy, an eye for an eye. The Code of Hammurabi would prevail. That was what was decided upon in 1948. What happened? The next day, May 15th, the Palestinians attack. They would not put up, just as they had before when the land was divided, they would not put up with partition. They would fight the Jews in what they considered their land. It was now the Palestinian Arabs who were fleeing in the aftermath of the war they had started. The waves of Palestinians leaving, and this is at the crux of today's problem. These were the waves of Palestinians leaving after the state of Israel was proclaimed, and you can see these various waves. The Arab exodus. How many fled their homes or were forced out or chose to leave or sold their homes? Approximately 700 to 750,000 Palestinian Arabs either chose to or were forced to leave their homes. The surrounding countries were out to attack the new state of Israel and force all Jews out of the Middle East. Jordan did not fight, but annexed the territories in what we now call the West Bank. And so what ensued for almost a year was what the Israelis call the War of Independence. The War of Independence, and here are a few photos of the fighting for which the Jews were totally prepared. They had been bringing in weapons and ammunition, airplanes, etc., for some time, anticipating how the Arabs would react to partition. Here are some other photos that were found. This is the map of the land acquired at the end of this War of Independence, by which the Israelis, now a state, went from the British Mandate in 48 to the UN partition in 47, both of which were rejected by the Palestinians, to the situation in 1948 after the War of Independence. So the question is, appreciating this history, one can very legitimately ask, whose land is it anyway? 1,875 years after the Jews had been driven out by the Romans, now the Jews are driving out the Arabs. Before the war, there were approximately 500,000 Jews and 450,000 Palestinians on the 55% of the land that the United Nations designated for a Jewish state. When the War of Independence, 1948, ended in July of 1949, Israel then controlled 78% of the territory. The population, mostly Jewish, but accommodating the 155,000 Palestinians who chose to remain rather than to flee. Into the new state of Israel streamed hundreds of thousands of Jews from Muslim, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Libya, some coming voluntarily, some forced to flee. The Israeli authorities passed a law appropriating the property of the Palestinian people who left, destroying the empty homes. There was nothing for them to which to return, using the stones of the destroyed homes to build new Jewish settlements. The Jews were dedicated, above all else, to the proposition that Jews from anywhere in the world were welcome to come to Israel. Faye, would you check the refreshments? After 25 years of British administration, the Middle East was a miserable, chaotic, and hungry area of the globe. The British had been, as Darwin described in The Natural World of 1859, a blundering, wasteful, clumsy, low, and horridly cruel situation. 55% of the land was a Jewish state. 45% of the land belonged to the Palestinians, with a population twice that of the Jews. As with all countries, what was first and foremost for the British was their own national self-interest, control of a region and the canal, which would allow the continuation of their commonwealth on which the sun never sets. The British failed completely, as they had in South Africa and in many other parts of the globe, to educate the masses in how to run the infrastructure of a country and to help, to the slightest degree, the different elements of the indigenous population to cooperate for the common good. There had been plenty of room for both Arabs and Jews. The Arab refugees of 48-49 were not the result of overcrowding, but of fear, hysteria, propaganda, misunderstanding, forced eviction, massacres and killing, and their rejection by all the surrounding Arab states. But this presentation this morning, which I've just concluded, is from the Jewish perspective. After we take a break and have refreshments, both bagels, lox, and Palestinian breakfast delicacies, we will continue with the story, the same years, the same events from the Palestinian perspective. So see you in about 20 minutes. Everybody smile. Lisa wants to take a picture. Okay, Lisa? Done? Okay. Lisa, you... Here's the microphone.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. Just wanted to let you know that I will send out weekly, or when I get the recordings and when they've been edited, I will send them out. So I will go ahead and send out week number 2, because I haven't done that yet for anybody that would like it. But I also believe, excuse me? Okay. Yep. I can, Maddie, I can send you the week number 1 if you didn't receive it. But I will send those out. It's probably like 3 or 4 days up to a week after, because they have to do some editing. And actually, it's better if they take the slides and input them in the in the studio versus just recording from David's talk. So
Yeah, that was true until I got a phone call or an email a few days ago. And Samantha, who runs the video recording program, said, Dr. Bisno, I had no idea you had so many slides. So forget the editing, you're going to get what you get, because she was overwhelmed with the number of slides that I sent her.
And I'm just going to take an opportunity, since I've got the floor, just so you all know, we have several events coming up, and Monday, perfect timing right before Election Day, ballots and breakthroughs, the future of how we vote. If anybody's interested, we still have space. It's at Jesse's. It includes your lunch. It starts at 12, so you want to be there a little beforehand. Bruce Garland, who is the treasurer of the New Hampshire Ranked Choice Voting, will be presenting. You would just check in, prepay, pray ahead of time would be less confusing, but your lunch is included, starts at 12. Lunch comes out about 12:50, and then Bruce will go back to the podium around 1:20 to either finish his presentation or take Q&A. So basically the program runs from 12 to 2. And we also have several other events coming up. If you aren't aware, there is, we are doing 4 trips to the Boston Symphony Orchestra. The November 15th trip is sold out, which is great. But we have one in February, March, and April. Those are all open. They're on Fridays. We're also doing Frozen, which is the Broadway musical. It's at actually the Portsmouth Music Hall, and the performance, the theater group is actually the Agunquit Playhouse Theater Group that does the annual holiday event at Portsmouth. If anybody would like to go, that is open and available for December. And also, I don't know if you know, but we're doing abroad and group travel. We're doing Paris and Canada by rail next year with Colette. 2 wonderful trips. And actually, the Paris trip, we're connecting with the University of Rhode Island, Ollie. They're going to be on the trip as well. So it could be an all Ollie group adventure. And then one last, David, and then I'll hand you back, is we did an overnight in Boston to see Hamilton a couple years ago. We've done the trip twice, and people really like the overnight with the theater. So we're doing Funny Girl overnight in Boston, February 5th and 6th. So just want to let you know about those. They're all on our website, and they're in our weekly emails on Tuesday. And tomorrow's email is just about the courses that are still open for fall, and letting you know about winter registration that will be December 3rd, which is a Tuesday when we're back from our Thanksgiving break. And the catalog should be online by the end of this week, and catalogs will be out about the same time, the printed catalog, if anybody requested that. So thank you very much. I will hand it back over to David and thank him again for offering this very important subject.
And thank you, Lisa, for making all this possible. Thank you. Lisa and I have worked together, I guess, since 1995, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
Okay, so now we're going to look at the same story through different eyes. And when I finish, and we'll be out of here in time to have some lunch and get to the Harvard-Dartmouth football game. Hopefully at the end of this hour or so, you will have even more appreciation for why there's a damn problem in the Middle East. And why it's a legitimate question to ask, whose land is it? Anyway, so just as I did with the first half, here is the Palestinian national anthem. Whoops. I guess it's not. May 14th, 1948. They had created a state, and not one day of peace since. As Zev Jabotinsky, leader of the Betar Zionist organization in Europe and mentor to Menachem Begin, had written in 1925, if you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must have a military force. Zionism, as we are pursuing it, is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it will stand or fall on whether we have armed forces. The Jews had suffered. They had need to flee many times over. They needed to find somewhere on earth to call home. No one wanted them. They were desperate. The ancient land of Canaan, which belonged to the Jews 2,000 years before, the Jews hadn't been there since 73 AD, was in 1897 at the time of the first Zionist Congress called Palestine. And its Jewish share of the population then was 6%. Arab, mostly Muslim Palestinians, 94%. Who were these Palestinians? Descendants of an extensive mixing of regional peoples, Canaanites, Philistines, Hebrews, Samaritans, Greeks, Romans, nomadic Arabs, Christian Europeans left over from the Crusades, Turks, and other minorities after the Islamic conquest of the 7th century. This mixed stock of people had developed an Arab Islamic culture for at least 1400 years. Between 1850 and 1917, Arabs in Palestine experienced transformations and challenges that shaped their identity and the region's dynamics for years to come. And this was only the beginning. The Palestinians had been living under Ottoman rule since 1516, for 400 years, experiencing relative stability, sheep herding, but also considerable commerce in the Middle East. But they never formed a state. They had a vibrant culture, but they faced challenges related to taxation and land ownership before the first Jews started arriving in the late 1800s. An invasion, if you want to call it that, by those Jews who were desperate to find a place to live. First a trickle, and then a groundswell. Many of the homes and villages in which the Palestinians were living were owned by wealthy, absentee landlords living in Damascus or Beirut. Many Palestinians were paying rent to someone they had never met. Just as if you went down to Florida for the winter and you found a condominium building and you rented an apartment, a condo in the building, but you never met the owner. You rented your apartment. That was the case for many thousands of Palestinians who were living in small stone homes owned by someone. They were renting, the money was coming in and going to Beirut or Damascus, and they never met the owner. Wealthy landlords in Lebanon and Syria took advantage of the situation, selling their Palestinian property, houses and villages, to arriving Jews from Europe, who were all too glad to pay whatever was asked, without any thought by the buyer or the seller of the indigenous Arabs who had no choice but to be displaced. To be sure, there were also direct sales of homes from Palestinian homeowners to Zionists. Jews all too happy to pay whatever was asked by the Palestinian family. Better a few German marks to conclude the transaction than a gun. And then, most troublesome for the Palestinians was their awareness that the British Balfour Declaration had declared British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, and their perceived need to flee, sale or no sale. Perceived is not quite the right word, for as the years advanced towards 1948, perceived by the indigenous population turned into threats, forced expulsion, violence, and massacres. The arriving Jews brought with them advancements in education, infrastructure, modern techniques of agriculture, and urbanization, leading to successful farms, turning the desert into growth, and the growth of cities, Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, and to the new city, Tel Aviv. Music, symphony halls, education, modern hospitals, shopping malls, and escalators. To us looking back, it is no surprise that Arab nationalism, resentment, frustration, and anger emerged as this indigenous population was being displaced and their land taken from them, whether legally by contract and deed or by fear, force, and guns. Might by Jews who hadn't been around for 2,000 years was making right. Whose land is it, anyway? Highly respected and educated Palestinian scholars suggest that Jews, in an attempt to justify their buying or claiming land between the river and the sea, just by naming their new state Israel, implies control and rightful possession. The concept ancient Israel, it is argued, has been invented and has silenced Palestinian history. Palestine was for millennia a land of many religions, the grand narratives of the Old Testament notwithstanding. Scholars of history, in an attempt to sort out whose land is it anyway, claim that biblical narratives are literary imagination, myths, legends, adaptation, theology, stories reflecting wisdom or the lack of it, ethics, and officially sanctioned, artificially created memory. The history of Palestine is one of contradictory traditions, full of twists and turns, of memory and forgetfulness, of suppression and recovery. It is suggested that we try to understand this documented history independent of Old Testament stories. Wishful and creative thinking it was for the Jews, in need of a place to which to escape and feel safe, to develop the myth that Palestine was a land without a people, for a people without a land. Such a statement implies that the hundreds of thousands of Muslim Arabs on the land when the Zionists arrived were not a people worth considering within the framework of the nations of white, racist European supremacy. Consistent with the notion that those Palestinians who inhabited the land of Canaan were not worth considering was the use by the Zionists of the term terra nullius, a Latin legal expression describing territory which was not subject to the sovereignty of any European state, and therefore could be acquired through occupation and settler colonization. Not so different than what the English, Spanish, French, Belgian, Portuguese, and Dutch colonizers had done throughout the world under the Discovery Doctrine, ignoring the indigenous population. As the Russian pogroms of killing Jews became known to the world, the British Aliens Act of 1905 restricted entry into Britain of Jews from Eastern Europe. As it became apparent towards the end of World War I that the Ottoman Empire, aligned with Germany, would collapse, the Holy Land became an attractive target for Britain, which was flexing its colonial muscles around the globe, keeping Jews out of the United Kingdom, and at the same time packing them off to Palestine, were two sides of the same anti-Semitic coin. No wonder that Chaim Weizmann, the ardent Zionist and urbane English chemist, was so chummy with the powers that be in Whitehall. As British colonial secretary in 1917, Balfour expressed his colonialist view, Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in the age of long British tradition. Present needs, future hopes. British needs, British hopes, far more important than the desires of 700,000 Arabs to remain in their ancient land. Furthermore, Balfour had, in addition to needs and hopes, a fear, the fear of mass immigration of persecuted Jews from Eastern Europe moving to his own beloved Anglican Britain. The Alien Act of 1905 was good, but now 12 years later, another opportunity to kill three birds with one stone. A win-win-win for Anglican Britain, its expanding imperialist empire in the Middle East with its Suez Canal and oil, and securing for the Jews a place to which to flee other than to England. If the decisions taken in London contain within them a decided contempt for the indigenous people of Palestine, well, so be it. To those arrogant and haughty who would work with Cecil John Rhodes in imposing British life in Central Africa, no problem. As Rhodes famously said, to have been born British is to have won the lottery of life. It is our place to make decisions. Indigenous populations be damned. A certain amount of enmity, if not a whole lot of enmity, towards those who followed the Islamic faith was built in. Despite the British government complaining that nothing shall be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in the Holy Land, Zionism resulted in catastrophic consequences for the indigenous people of Palestine. Settler colonization, ethnic cleansing, memoricide, and cultural genocide is how the Palestinians have seen what has happened to their lives. The Zionist settler colonialists, designed, allowed, and to some extent encouraged by the British, is at the heart of the continuing conflict in Palestine, where the Jews need and needed a safe place to go, and the Palestinians feel that their land has been and continues to be taken from them. As seen from the Palestinian point of view, the attitudes prevailing among too many Zionist settlers concerning the indigenous population, who had no intention of leaving, range from indifference and disregard to exploitation and patronizing superiority. It is not difficult to understand how and why this feeling led to and continues to lead to rocks, rage, rebellion, and rockets. Jewish acquisition of land took precedence over moral, ethical, and today legal considerations. To the arriving Jews, it was a matter of survival, no matter at someone else's expense. The systematic dislocation and transfer of the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine was simply a necessary side product of settling a land and carving out a state. There is no question the displaced Arabic Palestinians became internal refugees on a land they had long inhabited. In attempts to erase a Palestinian culture, efforts were comprehensive and successful by the early Zionist settlers to create a new Jewish culture, linked, however tenuously or imaginatively, to the biblical past. The post-1948 period saw top Zionist leaders, politicians, army commanders, archaeologists, scholars, and authors changing their names from Russian, Polish, and German to authentic Hebrew-sounding biblical names, as if they had been there forever. For the Hebraization of European names. For instance, Benjamin becomes Benjamin. Davidson becomes Ben David. David Gruen becomes David Ben Gurion, as if those names had been there forever, but they were made and changed on the spot. The changing of personal names was just the beginning. Arabic place names and Arabic road signs were changed. Maps reprinted. Arabic names replaced with transliterations of Hebrew. Zionists replaced what had been quintessential Palestinian landscapes for something more resembling new, old-time Eastern European shtetls settled in the sand. Now, perhaps some of you remember from the 40s and 50s, I asked Faye, and she said yes. She remembered these cans when you went to the drugstore or the corner store of putting some dimes in these cans for a cause that maybe as little children we didn't understand, but they were ubiquitous across the United States, the March of Dimes. So was this can. In many communities in which there are a large number of Jews, such as Brookline, Boston, or University City, St. Louis, or many other areas of the country, American Jews for years, understanding the commandment of tzedakah, charity, contributed to the Jewish National Fund, a philanthropic group in Israel dedicated to the planting of trees. And I remember growing up in St. Louis, and these cans were all over the city for whatever change you might have, such as when you go to the co-op, they said, you want to up it to the next dollar amount? Instead of that, just put your coins in this box, all of which was collected by the Jewish National Fund. Many of us remember the blue and white tin boxes into which we place coins and cash all over the United States. What could make one feel better? Contributing to the state of Israel. While many of the trees did aid in reforestation, water conservation, land development, and the greening of the land, and that's for what we thought we were contributing. What most of us contributors did not know, and I didn't know until recently when I started developing this presentation, we didn't know, we didn't realize, or perhaps we chose to ignore, is that across much of Israel, displaced Palestinians needing income were hired by Jews to plant thousands of trees with the intent that the Palestinian manual labor would turn the new nation's deserts into blooming gardens and productive farms, but also camouflage the remains of the Palestinian villages destroyed by the Zionists. Paid for with American dollars, creating a new collective memory, covering up the destroyed homes, covering up what the Palestinians referred to as the ethnic cleansing, the Nakba. Palestinians view the Israelis as having worked mightily to erase the remnants of the Arab-Palestinian society that lived in the country until 1948, to deny the catastrophe that Zionism inflicted on the Palestinian people. The old Palestinian, which lies under Israel, has disappeared. Sites of amnesia and erasure, changed forever by imagination and creativity. Palestinians see this as profound cultural ethnic cleansing by any other name. For many of the Zionists living on a kibbutz who wanted to consider being open-minded with regard to their neighboring Arabs, i.e. the film Exodus, but who in the end would evict Palestinian farmers from their land and homes, the justification was that a remote neighbor is better than a close enemy. Understandably, it was this attitude which would lead to the violent 3-year-long Palestinian rebellion of 1936-39. Eastern European Jewish settlers, escaping lethal anti-Semitism, claimed to represent an indigenous people returning to their homeland, albeit after 2,000 years of absence. What does an analysis show? The newly arrived Hebrews wanted to construct a new Jewish identity in every sphere which they could imagine. They were intent not only on occupying a land, but realizing that another crucial step in creating a new culture would become proficient as farmers tilling that land. And here you can see in the graph the change in the populations. The Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, all the way back to the time of Abraham and up roughly to the present time. Most notably, their land on socialist kibbutzim. Aaron David Gordon was their leader in encouraging these early Zionists to work the soil, become part of the land which they were claiming as their own. Creating a nation, working the land, planting trees to cover the land, changing names and signs were all of a piece, but underlying it all must be a common local language, putting it pejoratively, a faux indigenous spoken language to reinforce their identity as a people whose land it has been. And here you see Aaron David Gordon, who pushed working on the soil, which we know occurred around most of the kibbutzim. Most, if not all, of the Eastern European Zionists arriving in Palestine spoke Yiddish, a German, Polish, Russian dialect, spoken by the Jewish communities of Central Europe. And here you see in outline form in red the rough area of Europe, of Russia, in which the Jews were required to live. It was pointed out to me when I did this talk in Santa Barbara last winter by one of the attendees. They wanted to know how big was this land. I had always thought of it as pretty small. Well, it turns out it's not quite that small. It essentially is the size of France and Spain combined, as you can see on this diagram. So most of the Zionists who came in from the settlement of the Pale into the tiny new state of what would be Israel came from this area, and they were all speaking Yiddish. For early Zionist leaders, Yiddish was closely associated with passive, think feminine, Ashkenazi Judaism. While if a modern Hebrew language were to be created, the desired image would be a strong, masculine, settler, colonizing, fighting Hebrew man in Palestine. It would be Lazar Perelman from Russia. He would change his name from a Lazar Perelman to Eliezer ben Yehuda. And it was he who would encourage, create, and champion a brand new language, modern Hebrew, derived from Aramaic and Arabic roots. He and his fellow settlers considered his modern Hebrew language and Zionism as symbiotic. They needed each other. The new settlers, if they were going to create a state, needed their own language, albeit a modern Hebrew language created on the spot, as if it had been there for 4,000 years, which it hadn't. It was he who, with help and encouragement from his wife and a committee, fashioned a new language, a new Hebrew collective identity rooted in an invented ancient consciousness. Ben Yehuda knew that for the Jews to once again become a people, they needed a land and a language. So modern was Ben Yehuda's modern Hebrew, there never was a dictionary for the language until Ben Yehuda would write the dictionary of modern Hebrew. To the chagrin of the Palestinians, the new language would be adopted, taught in all schools, used officially, and spoken in all of Israel. The Arabic-speaking Palestinians were never consulted, their wishes and thoughts and ideas ignored. The new language became a major part of the construction of the militant Zionist Jewish national identity. The Jews were organized locally and internationally. As the end of World War II approached, the Arabs from lands that would be Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan agreed in 1944 to create a league in support of the cause of the Arabs of Palestine. 5 years later, 1949, barely independent of their former colonial masters, their efforts at working together proved totally ineffective. The fact that the Arabs were arguing among themselves without a league or any kind of cooperating coalition, local, much less international, such as the Israeli Jewish Agency, proved to be for them unfortunate, if not fatal. The international Arab community generally, and the Palestine Arabs particularly, were weak militarily, financially, and diplomatically. Their success was as disappointing as the photograph here of them is blurry. Meanwhile, with worldwide international connections and an acute experience sense of how Western business and the investment world works, unlike the Palestinian Arabs, Israeli bonds were marketed and sold successfully to the 6 to 7 million Jews in the United States over 75 years. And here are some examples of the posters, the advertisements to raise money. Here's the bond that people could buy, and many, many people did. In 75 years, by selling Israeli bonds, $50 billion was raised by the Jewish agency, and the Palestinians had nothing like this whatsoever. After the Israelis won the War of Independence, with surrounding Arab states soundly beaten, the Zionist success in Israel would result in cultural and lifestyle changes in what had been well-established Jewish communities over the entire Middle East. Once there was a place to which to safely emigrate, Jews who had been living relatively comfortable lives either departed willingly or were deported summarily from the Muslim, Shia, and Sunni states: Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, Iran, Syria, Jordan, Yemen, and Ethiopia. Most of the Jews from these states were as glad to move to Israel as their states were happy to see them go. Herzl employed a justification that has been a touchstone for colonialists at all times and in all places. The new state would become a staple argument of the Zionist movement. Jewish immigration would benefit the indigenous people of Palestine. It is their well-being, their individual wealth, which will increase when the Jews move in. They'll be better off, more civilized, more progressive. This is exactly what the British said in Cape Town when Faye and I were there. Exactly. We were with a British diplomat who was here meeting with the Iliad classes. They wanted to understand the context of the times. It was important for the British to be in South Africa. And the South Africans, Cape Town, Johannesburg, would be better off because the British had been there. In allowing immigration of Jews, bringing their intelligence, their financial acumen, and their means of enterprise to the country, no one could doubt that the well-being of the entire country will be the happy result. If that were not to happen, perhaps the Palestinians would be better off if we were to help them disappear, sounding not so different than Benjamin Netanyahu today. Herzl grasped the importance of disappearing the native population of Palestine to other provinces and territories of the Ottoman Empire in order for Zionism to succeed. The thinking was that the Arabs could ultimately be bribed or fooled into ignoring what the Zionist movement actually intended for Palestine. This condescending attitude toward the intelligence, not to speak of the rights, of the Arab population of Palestine was to be serially repeated by Zionist, British, European, and American leaders in the decades that followed down to the present day. It has been the colonial nature of the century-long conflict. Frustrated by watching their land in front of them being expropriated, it is not surprising that there was a massive revolt by the Arabs between 1936 and 1939. 17% of their adult male population was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled as the British employed 100,000 troops and air power to master Palestinian resistance. Meanwhile, a massive wave of Jewish immigration as a result of persecution by the Nazi regime in Germany raised the Jewish population in Palestine from 18% in 1932 to 31% in 1939. This provided the demographic critical mass and military manpower that were necessary for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. The Zionist effort, conducted with massive support from external powers, became over time a confrontation between two national entities, two peoples. Underlying this feature and amplifying it was the profound resonance for Jews, and also for many Christians, of their biblical connection to the historic land. Carefully woven well into modern political Zionism, this holy connection has become integral to it. A late 19th century national movement created for itself a biblical coat that was powerfully attractive to Bible-reading Protestants in Great Britain and the United States, blinding them to the reality of its colonial nature. For how could Jews be colonizing the land where their religion began? After 400 years, 20 generations under Ottoman rule, Palestinian Arabs, who made up 94% of the population in 1917, learned in a fragmentary fashion of a single sentence from London, telling them that for them and their families, one era would be ending and another beginning. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The words Palestinian and Arab do not appear in the 67 words of the Balfour Declaration. They were promised civil and religious rights, not political or national rights. These latter rights were granted to 6% of the population. Unlimited immigration of Jews would produce a future Jewish majority. Lloyd George Balfour and Secretary of State for the Colonies Winston Churchill assured Chaim Weizmann that by the term Jewish national home, they always meant an eventual Jewish state. This was essentially a declaration of war by the British Empire on the indigenous population. Any surprise, the anger by the Palestinians at Zionist land purchases, which often result in the expulsion of peasants from lands they considered to be theirs, the land being their source of livelihood, predictable the continuing countrywide violence. The British responded by bringing in divisions of troops, squadrons of bombers, and all the paraphernalia of repression that had perfected over many decades of colonial wars. That help to the Israelis today comes from the United States. The Jews' seductive biblical justification, coupled with their established international base of financing, leads one to remember the words of George Orwell. Sooner or later, a false belief bumps up against solid reality, usually on a battlefield, which is precisely what has and is happening to the Palestinians. The Zionist organization's massive capital investments, arduous labor, sophisticated legal maneuvers, intensive lobbying, effective propaganda, and covert and overt military means severely undermine any possibility of success for the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and independence they believed were their right, and for which they are still fighting now with 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians, the majority of whom within both cultures are willing to live peacefully together, but made impossible by the all-or-none, zero-sum game extremists on both sides who will stop at nothing until the others are completely gone. By the summer of 1949, Palestinian society had been devastated. 80% of the Arab population of the territory, which at war's end became the new state of Israel, had been forced from their homes and lost their lands and property. At least 720,000 of the 1.3 million Palestinians were made refugees. Israel controlled 78% of the territory of former mandatory Palestine and now ruled over the 160,000 Palestinian Arabs who had been able to remain. The Nakba, the defining catastrophe of 1948-49 for the Palestinians, was made all the worse by the second Nakba catastrophe yet to come in 1967. Like a slow, seemingly endless train wreck, the Nakba unfolded over a period of months. Its first stage from November 30th, 47 until the final withdrawal of British forces and the establishment of Israel, May 15th, 1948, witnessed successive defeats of the poorly armed and organized Palestinians and the Arab volunteers who had come to help them. Defeats planned as effectively as they were adroitly carried out by the Zionists, paramilitary groups, the Haganah, the Stern Gang, and the Irgun. The first stage saw a bitterly fought campaign that culminated in a countrywide Zionist offensive dubbed Plan Dalat in the spring of 1948, the conquest and depopulation in April of the two largest Arab urban centers, Jaffa and Haifa, and of the Arab neighborhoods of West Jerusalem, as well as scores of Arab cities, towns, and villages, including Tiberias on April 18th, Haifa on April 23rd, Safad on May 10th. The ethnic cleansing of 300,000 Palestinians began well before the State of Israel was proclaimed in May of 48. The second stage, after May 15th, another 400,000 were expelled and fled from their homes, escaping to neighboring Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, where they were allowed entry, but hardly welcomed and provided for, being forced to live in refugee camps with little sustenance. And today, in each of the surrounding countries, they are still in refugee camps. In Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the countries surrounding Israel, they're still in refugee camps. None of these escaping Palestinians were allowed to return. Most of their homes and villages were destroyed to prevent them from doing so. The escaping Nakba victims served to destabilize whatever order there was in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Poor, weak, and recently independent, as they all were. And now the story of the worst. What happened is shameful. Deir Yassin, a village of 600 Arab Palestinians. It would be easier not to tell you the story, but it is part of the story. This is the geography as roughly seen from the air. To the east is Tel Aviv, along the Mediterranean Sea, and maybe a 45-minute drive from Tel Aviv, you're in Jerusalem. On April 9th, 1948, the road connecting Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was thought to be irrevocably important to the Israelis. They must control that road for all incoming supplies from the rest of the world, from the ocean in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But part way up is this Palestinian village of Deir Yassin. 130 Irgun and Lehi fighters, after giving fair warning to evacuate the village, which they did. They just needed to control the village. They gave fair warning to all the people in this village to leave, much like what's happening in Gaza today. Leave before the village is going to be taken over. These volunteer Irgun Lehi fighters committed the largest and most brutal massacre up to that time, killing 107 Palestinian Arab villagers, men, women, and children, in order to have absolute control of this road I'm showing you between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And here are a few pictures of the massacre of those who did not leave as warned by the present Israelis. Deir Yassin. In the bleak new reality, after the Nakba, more than 1 million Palestinians faced a world turned utterly upside down for them. Wherever they were, whether inside Palestine or outside Palestine, they experienced profound social disruption. For the majority, this meant destitution, the loss of homes, jobs, and deeply rooted communities. Villagers lost their land and livelihoods, urbanites their properties and capital. The Mufti of Jerusalem would never again regain his pre-war authority. The ignorance of generation after generation of Arab rulers about the workings of the American political system and international politics would consistently deprive the Arab world of any possibility of resisting American influence or shaping U.S. policy. Until 1966, most Palestinians lived under strict martial law. Their expropriated land was deemed legally obtained by the Israeli state. Dispossessed Arabs, whether renting their home or owning it, could neither buy back nor lease what had once been their property. 94% of Palestinian land had been Arab-owned prior to 1948. Accustomed to being a substantial majority in their own country and region, the Palestinian Muslims suddenly had to learn to make their way as a despised minority in a hostile environment, as subjects of a country that never defined itself as a state of all its citizens. Over the years, intermittent but frequent Arab uprisings have been dealt with by a policy of disproportionate force. Transmitted through Israeli heroes such as Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Rabin, and Ariel Sharon, Ben-Gurion's original belligerent policies have pervaded the Israeli government's dealing with its neighbors ever since the early days and up to today. If the Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate, and the Palestinian loss of the 1949 War of Independence were all part and parcel of the Nakba catastrophe for the Palestinian people, the aftermath of the 1967 Six-Day War produced for them the second Nakba catastrophe. The Jews, in 6 days, not only defeated the surrounding Arab nations, but claimed the entire West Bank, which they refer to as their ancient home, Judea and Samaria. 250,000 Palestinians were expelled. Whether David Ben-Gurion really said of the displaced Palestinians, the old will die and the young will forget or not know, is not known for certain, but the statement is proven to be fatefully false. The political impact for the Palestinians by the 1982 invasion of Lebanon by the Israelis, backed by the United States to rout out the PLO terrorists who were sending bombs and missiles into northern Israel, was enormous. It brought about major regional changes that affect the Middle East to this day, and about which we read in today's New York Times. The terrorist group Hezbollah, livid with the conditions imposed upon the Palestinians, arose in Lebanon, closely aligning themselves with the heavily armed Shia Iranians. Because of that association and support, Hezbollah is today the major existentialist threat to Israel. Besieged and bombarded, Beirut was the first and only Arab capital to be attacked and occupied by Israel. The Paris of the Middle East was to be no more. With the PLO's evacuation from Beirut, the Palestinian cause appeared to have been gravely weakened. Ariel Sharon seemed to have achieved all of his core objectives. However, the paradoxical result of these events was gradually to shift the center of gravity of the Palestinian national movement away from the neighboring Arab countries to back inside Palestine. It was there in Lebanon that the first intifada broke out 5 years later, in December 1987, and spread quickly to Israel, with results that shook both Israeli and world public opinion. As the Nakba had done decades earlier, the stinging defeat of the PLO in Beirut, across the border, outside Israel, whether U.S. or other shelling, produced a new and different form of resistance by the Palestinians to the multi-pronged war being waged against them. Sharon and Begin had launched the invasion beyond Israel's borders to defeat the PLO and demoralize the Palestinians, thereby freeing Israel to illegally absorb the West Bank, occupied territories. But the end result was to spur Palestinian resistance and locate the resistance inside Palestine. The law of unintended consequences produced the devastating first of two intifadas from 1987 to 1993. The second intifada would follow the failure of the Oslo Accords in 2000. So what is an intifada? An intifada is a spontaneous, bottom-up campaign of resistance, rage, and revenge, born of an accumulation of frustration and initially with no connection to the formal political Palestinian leadership. As with the 1936-39 revolt, the two intifadas' length and extensive support was proof of its broad popular support and frustrations. The uprisings were flexible and innovative, developing a coordinated leadership while remaining locally driven and controlled. We see it playing out today in Gaza. Among its activists then and now are men and women, elite professionals and business people, farmers, villagers, the urban poor, students, small shopkeepers, and virtually members of every other segment of society. Women played a central role, taking more and more leadership positions, despite its society being a male-dominated culture. What happened on the White House lawn in September 1993, and what did it really mean for the Palestinians? Rabin for Israel recognized the PLO as representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognized the State of Israel for the first time. While Rabin had done something no other Israeli had ever done by formally conceding that there is a Palestinian people, accepting the PLO as their representative, and opening negotiations with them, obtaining in return Palestinian recognition of the State of Israel. This exchange was neither symmetrical nor reciprocal. Israel had not recognized a Palestinian state, just a people, or even made a commitment to allow the creation of one. A national liberation movement had obtained nominal recognition from its oppressors without achieving liberation. This meeting at the White House, the shaking of hands, proved to be a resounding historic mistake for the Palestinians, one with grave consequences for the Palestinian people. In 1917, Arthur James Balfour stated that in Palestine, the British government did not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The present need of the Zionists are of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit the ancient land. After 74 years of careful, deliberate decisions by our State Department that for peace to have any chance at all in the Middle East, the U.S. Embassy should and must remain in Tel Aviv, where it had been since 1948, rather than move it to Jerusalem, as holy and important a city to the Arabs as it is to the Jews, discarding caution to the winds and not caring a whit about the Palestinians. President Trump, advised and goaded on by his Orthodox Jewish son-in-law, Jared Kushner, recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the U.S. Embassy there. To say this move by our president antagonized the Arabs is an understatement. The center of the Palestinians' history, identity, culture, and worship was thus summarily disposed of without even the pretense, again, of consulting their wishes. With the establishment of Israel in Palestine, Zionism did succeed in fashioning a potent national movement and a thriving new society with astounding success in every field of endeavor, and a place for Jews from anywhere on earth to find a home and presumably live in peace. But it could not fully supplant the country's original population, which is what would have been necessary for the ultimate triumph of Zionism. The Zionist success, if that's what you want to call it, after 75 years of continual warfare, is in no small part due to the new Jewish arrivals casting themselves as the true indigenous historic proprietors of the land. Whose land is it, anyway? Israel's 1948 Declaration of Independence proclaimed complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. Dozens of laws have been passed to that effect. The real truth is that Israeli laws have severely restricted or totally banned Arab access to land and to residency in all Jewish communities, formalized the seizure of the private and collective property of non-Jews, and prevented most indigenous Palestinians who were made into refugees from returning to their land and home. The problem is more stark today, with a total Arab population in Palestine from the Jordan River to the sea that is equal to or perhaps slightly larger than the Jewish population. That internal fact, coupled with the fact that the two most violent groups bent on the destruction of the Israeli state, Hamas and Hezbollah, are closely aligned with and supported by the state of Iran, which is bent on Israel's elimination. Without one day of peace, in the 75 years since its founding in 1948, one can only wonder whether Herzl, Weizmann, and Ben-Gurion might have thought differently with regard to land and relocation if they knew what would be the struggle without end of the state they had created. Might I ask, and you wonder, might these three men, might they have come to a different answer if they had asked themselves, whose land is it anyway? It's a tough question. I hope you appreciate and understand why it's a difficult question. It begs for a solution, and it's really, really tough. It's as if Native Americans appeared at your door this morning and said, this is our land. This is our land. You took it from us. Now get out or find something else, but we want our homes. We had a teepee where your land in Hanover, your house in Hanover now stands. So at this point, I'm finishing the third of 5 lectures. I had planned next week to do the fourth, entitled Wars and Accords, to share with you what has gone on since 1948 between the Palestinians and Jews. And the fifth week was to have been a visit by this gentleman, Mohsen Madawi, about whom I want to tell you for a few minutes, and tell you of the probable change. I met Mohsen Madawi 8-9 years ago now, when I was doing The World of Yesterday. How many were in that class? Yeah, a number of you. And we were talking at that time about Vienna, Paris, Dreyfus trial, etc. And I introduced the idea back then of Herzl, the Viennese journalist, moving to Paris to cover the Dreyfus trial. And his recognizing in Paris that for the Jews to be safe, they needed to have their own land. And I was about to do the seventh, or the last class on Palestine, and we were going to have a banquet, a luncheon for all the students in the class. And we're going to do it at the Canoe Club. And so everybody, I asked if you want to come to the luncheon, give me a check for $25, and we'll have a final luncheon banquet at the Canoe Club. So I had the stack of checks, and I walked into the Ledyard Bank. I walk up to the teller, right here in Hanover, and behind the counter is this gentleman whose skin is a little bit darker, but with piercing, riveting, sparkling eyes, dressed in a suit, button-down shirt, necktie. And I looked at him. I was, I guess, 78 years old. This kid looked like he was 23 or 24. And I asked him a simple question. I said, where are you from? And he turned the tables on me completely. And he said, well, where do you think I'm from? And all of a sudden, I, the professor, four times his age, have been put on the defensive. And I've got to answer his question. And so I stammered around, and I said, I don't know, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, someplace. And he said, no, none of those places. I'm from Palestine. And my mouth dropped open. I said, you're from Palestine? How'd you get out? Okay, that's how we met. And at that time, Gail Trottier, maybe you know her, she was the manager of the Ledyard Bank. She was at the desk watching this conversation. She knows me very well. And apparently she knew this fellow Mohsen because she had hired him as a teller. And to become a teller at the Ledyard Bank, I think you go through either 6 or 8 weeks of training. In a week and a half, he got everything. And they made him a teller in a week and a half. He understood everything. And now he's standing accepting my checks. And I said, what's your first name? Mohsen. I said, Mohsen, would you be willing to talk to my class? Because we're going to talk about Palestine and the Zionists. He said, I've never talked to an audience before. And I said, well, I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to invite you to talk to my class next week. He said, but I have a job here at the Ledger Bank. And Gail was listening to all this, and she said, oh, Dr. Bisno, I'll give Mosen a day off, and he can come talk to your class. So Mosen said, okay, he had no idea what an Iliad class was. And so I told him where to come. We were using the building in Wilder, the David, and so Mosen came in and sat right next to Faye, and I was telling a group just like this that, okay, we're talking about Palestine and Dreyfus and all this, but to really understand Palestine, it would really be good, wouldn't it, to listen to a Palestinian. And I said, you know what? We have a Palestinian here, and people were stunned. And I asked Mosen to come up. Were you there, Amy? I asked Mosen to come up. He had never spoken to an audience, and he held this Iliad group of about 120 people. You could have heard a pin drop. He was eloquent. Okay.
More than that, David, we were in tears.
You're in tears. You remember that. Yeah. Okay. And then Mosen came to lunch with us at the Canoe Club. And then we got to know Mosen, and he came to the house, and we became really close friends. All right, now let me tell you a quick story. Mosen was here in Hanover for about 5-6 years, auditing courses at Dartmouth. He had 2 or 3 years of schooling at Birzeit University, and he had concluded as a teenager growing up, a number of his family had been killed by Israeli Defense Forces. They lived in a refugee camp outside of Ramallah, and had never been outside of Ramallah, the West Bank, for 4 generations. They lived 27 miles from the Mediterranean Sea. He had never seen a beach. He had never seen the Mediterranean Sea for 4 generations. And one day, I'm telling it very quickly, he was taking courses at the University of Birzeit University in Ramallah, which is the West Bank University. And he sees this really pretty blonde girl. And Mosen is really good looking. And they start a conversation. And he learns that this girl is on some sort of fellowship or grant allowing her to do some studies in the Middle East. And she lives in Jerusalem for the time being, has a little car. But to get the information she needs, every day she drives the car down the road, across the checkpoints, were manned by Israeli Defense Forces. She waves at them. She's very cute. And she's into the West Bank, and she is at Birzeit University. Now she's walking around and meets Mosen. So they develop a relationship, to say the least. And Mosen had never, I don't think, ever seen a blonde girl before. And she said something like, I'm paraphrasing this, have you ever seen the Mediterranean Sea? No, never. None of my ancestors for 4 generations have ever been to Tel Aviv or seen the Mediterranean Sea. We're not allowed out. And have you ever been to a mall or seen an escalator? No. And so I don't know all the deal, but they decided to get married. And on the appointed day, she says, get in the car, get under this blanket and get down on the floor in front of the driver's seat, and I'll get in my car, and we're going to take you to Jerusalem. And they get to the checkpoint. She waves and flirts with all the young IDF soldiers who knew her very well because she went back and forth every day. Bye, have a good time, Megan. I think her name is Megan, right? Megan. And they're through. Now he's first time in 4 generations out of the West Bank, and she drives into Jerusalem and shows him the Jerusalem Mall with something, an escalator. And he said, okay, so now let's go to Tel Aviv and let's walk in the sand and see the crashing waves of the Mediterranean Sea. And so she was a Dartmouth medical student. And so she told Mosen, we're out of here, let's go to America. So he says, okay. That's how, I'm doing it very quickly, that's how he arrived in Hanover, New Hampshire. And I meet him and he talks to, all right, let me tell you quickly what's happened since. In their greatest wisdom, Dartmouth was really, really missed a gem and did not admit him as a student. after taking 3 auditing courses at Tuck, at Thayer, engineering, computers, diplomacy, they didn't admit him. And so he was given a full scholarship to Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and he left here, became good friends with a number of us, Sven, Steve, a number of us all used to go canoeing with Mosen. We go out to Grafton Pond. He's been many times at our home. We met his wife. They eventually quickly got a divorce, and we didn't see much anymore of Megan, but Mosen. And then from Lehigh, after 2 years, and I can tell you this, he fell in love with a Jewish girl. He falls in with a Jewish girl. What was her name?
So many of them.
And he calls me Dr. David, and he said, I'd like to come over with Steve. What was her name? Okay, I'll think of it. And so it turns out that her parents are going to be visiting Hanover. And so on our back porch in Hanover, we have Mosen and his Jewish girlfriend from Lehigh and her parents. And you know, with this Muslim Palestinian young man. Okay, once Columbia...
It was Nadine. Yeah.
What?
Nadine.
Nadine. Yeah. That's right. Her name was Nadine. That's right. Thanks. And so as time went on, Columbia University in New York somehow recognized Mosen. And so they offered Mosen full room, board, tuition, scholarship, finish your degree in philosophy, and you have admission to our law school, diplomacy, whatever you want. By that time, he had given upwards of 75 lectures to churches and synagogues all through New England. He was now a master at standing before an audience and talking with them with complete ease, grace, aplomb. And so he has now been at Columbia for, I think this is his 3rd year, at Columbia, New York, majoring in philosophy with the intention of going to their law school, and they've already admitted him to their law school, but he's had second thoughts about maybe he should go to diplomacy school and not wasting his time with law school. Okay, so we flew him out to Santa Barbara last March. When I did the same 5-week class, he did the 5th week, and all kinds of connections were made. So then I said, Moses, I'm going to do this in Hanover. And he lives right in Wilder, right down from Danowitz. So he said, I'm happy to come to your class. And I'll know half the people in the room. And so everything was scheduled for the last class in 2 weeks from today. But Moses is really busy. And he's really not good at quickly corresponding back and forth, whether it's by phone, email, message, etc. It's just... So I really wanted to be able to tell you today that we're all on for Mosen in 2 weeks. That's the plan. So Mosen finally did get through to me yesterday and said, Dear Dr. David, I don't think we ever agreed on the 16th of November. We agreed on November 9th, next week. Well, he said, well, I don't know how that happened. But he said, I can't come on the 16th because I'm talking at the United Nations. That's what he wrote. I can't come because he's talking to the United Nations. But as agreed upon, I didn't agree to that, but he said, as agreed upon, that's how they do diplomacy. I'll come next week. And so I wrote him back, I said, perfect, fine, it's just great. Everybody will be waiting to see you, and you'll be here next week. But I just want to really confirm that and know whether, I told him we'd pay for your airfare if you want to fly up on Cape Air from New York and be here for everybody. I told him that certain of you would be in the room and he knows you very well and everything's fine. Well, yesterday afternoon, last evening, I just wanted confirmation. Guess what? I haven't got it. Mosen is either, oh no, and he said on the 15th, he's talking to the United Nations. So the idea, the expectation is that next week when you walk in, Mosen will be here. With our fingers crossed. The best I can say is I hope so. And so that's where we are. I think we still have enough time to grab some lunch and and be at the Harvard-Dartmouth game. So thank you very much. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week.